My encounter happened early February of 1985 in a farming swamp area in deep South Florida outside Homestead. My father called it East Glade. Some folks call it Double Canals. It's a very flat area, fairly large at roughly 5 by 8 miles, where corn and potatoes are grown in the winter, with a mix of willow, buttonwood, scrub oak, sawgrass, and cattail slough. It is crisscrossed with small drainage ditches that we called jumpers because they were just wide enough to jump across, some larger ditches, and 2 large canals, hence double canals. The drainage ditches were dug for fill for the roads, which are set up in straight north-south, east-west grids, and they divide the area up into large plots of fields and swamp. It was late afternoon, and the temperature was cold for subtropical Florida. Mid-50s, expected to drop to the low 40s that night. My buddy and I had been fishing the jumpers right smack in the middle of the glade, on the edge where the farms yield to the swamp. About an hour and a half before sunset, I saw a figure approach us from the swamp, about 3/4 of a mile down the road we were fishing on. My friend was around the corner, so at the time I was alone near the car. I knew it was a person, but it was moving very slowly, so I didn't pay it much mind and continued fishing but kept an eye on it. After about a half hour, I could make out it was a woman. Then as she got closer, I could tell she was barefoot, wearing only a long pink t-shirt with a teddy bear on it, the kind young girls sleep in. When she finally got close enough to talk to me, I could see she had been out there a while. She had a slight build. Her mouse brown hair looked like it had been wet earlier in the day and not brushed very well, but her feet didn't appear very dirty. Her skin was slightly ashen, but not pale, and she wasn't blemished. She seemed fairly healthy, didn't seem lost or overly concerned about her situation. She asked me for a cigarette, of which I didn't have. When I told her I had none, she just looked at me blankly. I then asked her what in the hell she was doing out there. She replied, "I've been swimming with the alligators." I asked her who left her out there. I figured she was a hooker. She just said, "They left me here." I asked her if she would like a ride back to town when we were done fishing, and she said she had no place to go. I told her that I couldn't, in good conscience, leave her out there, and I would give her a few bucks and then drop her off at the convenience store. She just said, "I'll wait over there." She walked about 50 feet in front of my car, and she squatted down in the road and pulled the shirt over her knees and just kind of settled there. Now this was getting kind of strange, so I went and found my buddy to tell him I had found a crazy lost hooker we were both going to take back to town. We spoke about it out of earshot of the girl and decided where we were going to drop her that would be the least likely place that anyone would see us dropping off a fallen flower. He did ask if she propositioned me, which she had not. Then it seemed even stranger. He also said something to the effect that she might be trying to set us up to be rolled, which wasn't likely because I was wearing a rather large pistol. When it gets time to leave, she gets in the back of my '72 4-door Chevrolet, and off we go. My buddy asked basically the same questions I did, and she gave the same answers. Swimming with the alligators, not gators, alligators, and that they left her out there. She also said she didn't have any more friends in town, that they were all gone. From that point, we just rode in silence. About half a mile from the pavement in civilization, she blurts out, "I forgot my shoes." I told her she could get more shoes, but she reiterated that she had to have her shoes. I told her it's almost dark and we're not going back for shoes, to which she replied, "Let me out. I have to get my high heels." I wasn't going to argue with some crazy hooker, so I stopped to let her out. She exited the car from the back passenger door, and at that moment my buddy just looked at me and said, "She's a spook." I told him he was nuts. "She's a hooker, not a spook." He said, "No, a spirit." As I was arguing with him, I looked in the rearview mirror and she was gone. I turned around, no sign of her. The road we were on was white rock, 50 feet wide, and had flat, freshly planted farm fields on either side. Not a bush or tree in sight, but it did have a jumper on either side. I still thought he was a loony, as she was. Then he turned around and put his hand on the seat where she had been for the last 20 minutes. It was cold as ice when I put my hand on it. He then said, "Did you notice she didn't smell like anything?" Then when he mentioned it, she didn't. For someone who had spent a day in the South Florida swamp, she had no odor at all. I didn't tell hardly anyone about it except my wife. Then one afternoon, while chatting with my father, I told him the story. With a serious look as he could have, he told me that he had seen the same girl 50 years prior in the same area. When she approached him, she asked the same question, "Do you have a cigarette?" At that time, he said, she was completely naked except for a pair of high-heel shoes. Call bunk on it if you want, but this encounter made a believer out of me.
This is a very difficult story for me to tell. It's extremely personal and disturbing. This happened back in the year 2019 when I was 19 years old. A little about myself. I'm an athletic blonde, 5'6", around 125 pounds, living in Southern California. Your typical Cali girl. I'm kind of a tomboy too. I love sports, volleyball, skateboarding, and especially surfing. Okay, now onto my story. I had the day off from my college classes and my part-time job. It was a beautiful sunny morning, so I decided to go surfing at a secluded beach I knew about near Topanga Canyon. I put on my bikini top, my swimming shorts, grabbed my surfboard, and headed off to catch some waves. My favorite thing to do. I drove to a grassy area near the beach and parked my car. This particular beach is bordered by high coastal bluffs, and it's over 100 feet down to the sand. I had to walk down a very old, rickety old staircase to get down to the beach. The beach below is very rocky and not very suitable for surfing. But about a mile down from that point, the rocks end. It opens up into a rock-free area about 100 yards wide, with awesome waves. A perfect spot for surfing. It is a very isolated spot and hardly anyone ever goes there. In fact, I've only ever encountered another surfer there once before. Going there this early in the morning, I knew there wouldn't be anyone else around. Once I got down the stairs, I started jogging along the beach carrying my surfboard. As I expected, there was no one else in sight. I really didn't have a care in the world at that time, and I was just enjoying the scenery. I loved the fresh, salty air and the sound of the waves crashing against the larger rocks. It was starting out as a perfect day, but after jogging along the beach for about a half mile, something caught my attention near the water's edge. I slowed down to take a better look. There was an object about 20 yards away from me, washed ashore near the base of one of the larger rocks. The waves were gently moving it back and forth. It looked like a dark black or brown wooden crate of some kind, with long strands of seaweed hanging down all over it. I stopped jogging and stared at it, trying to figure out what it was. But I was too far away and I just couldn't see enough detail. So I laid my surfboard and walked over to it. As I got closer, the ocean breeze blew in a musty, stinky odor. When I reached it, I immediately recognized what it was. To my amazement, I saw that it was a coffin, an old wooden coffin covered with seaweed. It was such a bizarre sight. A coffin on the beach? It looked old, and it looked like it had been in the water for a very long time. I just stared at it for a while. I really wasn't sure what I should do. It was floating in a few inches of water, and the waves were crashing all around it. I didn't want it to get washed back out to sea again, so I decided to move it away from the water. I noticed it had a rope handle on top of the head end, so I took hold of the rope handle with both hands and began to drag it away from the water's edge. It was quite heavy and hard to maneuver, so I knew it wasn't empty. There was definitely something inside. I dragged it several yards onto the beach and propped it up against a rock. I rested the head end of the coffin on the rock, angled up to about my waist height. Now I could examine it more easily without needing to kneel down. But being this close to it wasn't at all pleasant because it stank. It stank badly. But oh well, I would just have to deal with it. Anyway, I started to pull the strands of seaweed off the lid to get a better look. Once I had most of the seaweed off, I began looking for markings. Anything written on the surface that might help me figure out where it came from or how it got here. But there was nothing. I looked all over it, but I couldn't find anything. No writing or markings of any kind. Nothing on the outside to help me figure this out. So I knew what I had to do next. If I wanted to solve this mystery, I would have to open it and look inside. I really didn't want to open it. It was just such a strange situation. Nothing felt right about it. I can't explain it any better. I just felt like I shouldn't open it. But my curiosity was not going to let me just walk away and forget about it. I had to know what was inside. So slowly, I worked up my courage and I carefully began lifting the coffin's lid. Now, I know most people aren't going to believe what I'm about to say, but I don't care. I also don't blame you one bit for not believing it, because I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't seen it myself. But it's true. As I opened it, more of the putrid odor poured out. I turned my head away slightly. Then I saw it. I saw a woman's body inside. Yes, a woman's body. I remember gasping at the sight of her, and then coughing out all the yuck odor I inhaled. She was strange looking. She was extremely pale, and her clothes were some kind of an old style. I don't know anything about old style clothing, but I have done some research since this happened. The best I can describe them is that they looked like the clothing women wore on the TV show Little House and the Prairie. Now, here's something else unbelievable. The woman and the inside of the coffin were dry. That's right, completely dry. There was a cushion lining, and it was dry. The woman and her clothing were also completely dry. This didn't seem possible. The coffin was very old. The wood was heavily worn, and it didn't look watertight. The lid was warped and didn't fit flush all the way around. So how could that be possible? I stared at the woman in utter amazement. Another thing, she was not decayed at all. I didn't see her breathing, so I was certain she was dead. She had to be dead. But besides being very pale, she looked like she could have been alive. But I knew she was dead. She just had to be. After examining the woman's body for a minute, I had enough of the gruesome sight. So I turned my attention away from her and began looking up around the inside of the coffin's lid. I was again looking for any writing or markings that would give me clues to this woman's identity. Once again, I found nothing. Now, here comes the next part that is unbelievable. As I glanced back down at her, I suddenly saw that her eyes were open. Yes, her eyes were open, and she was looking at me. I didn't see her open her eyes, so I don't know how long she was looking at me. Her face remained blank, expressionless, but she was awake, and she was watching me. In her eyes, now listen to me, they were black, completely black. Absolutely no white parts or pupils at all. Nothing else. Just solid black. It was horrible. Okay, now this is where things get really bad for me. I'm fuzzy on a lot of the details because everything started happening so quickly. I remember that I screamed. Then I let go of the lid, and it fell shut with a loud thud. I was in shock. I just stood there, staring at the closed coffin. I remember so vividly staring at it, knowing she was inside, feeling that she could still see me. I didn't stand there for long, as I remember it, only a matter of moments. Then I began to step away from the coffin. I was turning to run away when it happened. I was attacked. Another woman lunged at me from across the coffin and slapped her hands around my neck. I never saw her coming. She must have snuck up on me while my attention was on the woman in the coffin. I screamed again, louder this time, but my scream was quickly silenced. as the woman squeezed my throat closed with her thumbs, and she kept squeezing, holding my throat closed. I couldn't breathe. She was choking me. My eyes focused in on her. She was a tall black woman with a large afro. I had never seen her before. She was a lot taller than me. She had to have been over 6 feet tall. Her eyes were what I remember the most. They were not solid black. They were normal eyes, but they were so intense and so full of hatred. Hatred for me. I was confused and terrified. Instinctively, I grabbed hold of her wrist and began trying to pry her hands from around my neck. Her hands were very cold and very strong. They felt like icy steel around my neck. I couldn't pry them off. I soon began making choking sounds each time I tried to inhale. My choking was getting more and more frequent as my need to breathe was increasing. It became obvious. This woman wasn't going to stop choking me. She wasn't going to let me breathe. She was trying to kill me. I was in a fight for my life. After a brief struggle, with both of us standing, she slowly began pulling me off balance, bending me over backward. I resisted as best I could, but she was just too strong. I felt jagged wood scratching into the bare skin of my shoulder, then into my back. I was being pinned down onto the coffin. She had me pinned down against the lid of the coffin. I was trapped. I have never been so terrified. Panic took over. I began kicking at her wildly with my legs. I connected with numerous hard kicks. My legs are pretty strong, so I know that must have hurt. Then, I pushed against her wrists with all the remaining strength in my arms, while making a sustained effort to inhale. I remember releasing a hoarse choking sound, and as I did, air started flowing into my lungs. I had loosened her grip enough to take a partial breath. The woman looked furious about it. I saw her gritting and baring her teeth. She was definitely having difficulty holding me down. Then I kicked her really hard several more times. More air reached my starving lungs. Another partial breath. Nothing ever felt so good. For that moment, I thought I had a chance. I thought I might be able to get free and escape. But then, she leaned herself all the way forward until she was directly above me. Suddenly, I felt intense pain in my throat. She had begun pressing down directly upon my throat with all her weight. It hurt so much. I've never felt pain like that before. It felt like she was crushing my throat. I could no longer make a sound, and I could no longer get any air into my lungs. Now, my lungs felt like they were on fire, like they were burning. I needed to breathe, but I couldn't. I was completely overwhelmed. I simply couldn't struggle any longer. I didn't have energy to keep kicking. All the strength drained out of my arms. My hands felt like heavy weights, and I couldn't even hold onto her wrists anymore. My eyes filled with tears from the pain as I began losing consciousness. The last thing I remember seeing is a blurry image of her evil, hateful face. Then nothing. That was it. Nothing. I totally lost consciousness. That would have been the end of my life. I was essentially dead. But by some miracle, I didn't die. Somehow life remained in me. The next thing I remember is looking up at the sky. It was a bright blue sky. I was laying on my back on the sand. I remember just laying there, looking up. I could feel cold water hitting my left arm and my left side. After a while, I don't know how long, I started noticing pain in my throat. I tried to swallow and it hurt a lot. I rolled over onto my side, then I sat up. At first, I didn't know where I was or what had happened, but the memories began to return. I looked around. The coffin was gone. There were 2 lines in the sand leading off down the beach. They were drag marks. That woman had taken the coffin and dragged it away down the beach, in the direction I'd been jogging. My surfboard was still there, laying in the sand where I'd left it. I slowly stood up, my legs felt wobbly. I got my surfboard and began walking back the way I'd come, in the opposite direction from where the drag marks went. No more jogging. I felt very weak. It took me a long time to walk back to the stairs, and an even longer time to climb them up. I was completely exhausted once I reached the top. Thankfully, the grassy spot where my car was parked was only a short distance away. I put my surfboard in the back seat and drove home. Calling the police would have been useless. It is an absolutely crazy story, and I had no proof of any of it. There were some red marks on my throat, but they weren't too noticeable and quickly faded and were gone after a day or two. I had difficulty talking and swallowing for a while, and my throat was very sore. I lied to my friends and just said I had a cold. None of them questioned that or thought any more about it. I did have some nasty scratches on my back from struggling while being pinned down against the coffin's lid. The only other mark I had was a deep gash on my left elbow. I don't know how that happened. I figure I might have hit my elbow on a rock when I fell down onto the sand. Needless to say, I have not been the same since this awful experience. I'm not as outgoing and carefree as I was. I don't go surfing as much anymore. When I do, I don't surf alone. And I never go anywhere near that beach. I don't understand what I walked into that day. I don't know who or what the woman inside that coffin was. The thing that comes to mind is, of course, a vampire. But I never saw any fangs or anything like that. Just those solid black eyes. And then there was the woman who attacked me. Who the hell was she? And why did she try to kill me? It's such a horrible memory. I tried to piece it all together and figure out what happened. The best I can come up with is this. That woman who attacked me was looking for the coffin. I don't understand how or why she would have known it washed ashore there. It's such a secluded beach. Most days there wouldn't be anyone around for miles. But unfortunately, I was there for that morning, and I found the coffin first. So she attacked me and tried to kill me to keep her secret. Whatever that secret is. After I lost consciousness, at some point, she let go of my neck. I must have tumbled down lifelessly onto the sand. I'm certain she thought I was dead. She took the coffin and began dragging it away, leaving my lifeless body on the beach. In fact, I was very, very nearly lifeless. Noting the time I got back to my car, I factored in everything else that happened that morning. And I estimate that I laid there unconscious on the beach for over an hour. That means it took my body over an hour of shallow breathing to get my oxygen level up high enough for me to wake up, even with cold water hitting me. That's very, very close to death. I think about my parents and my family too. If I'd been killed, my body would have been washed out to sea with the rising tide. Had my body ever been found, I would have been assumed that I died in a surfing accident, that I hit my head on a rock and drowned. Something like that. No one would have ever known what really happened to me. There is something evil going on out there in Southern California. It's real. And I nearly lost my life simply for catching a glimpse of it.
I used to work on the north slope of Alaska in the oil industry. The work we were doing required us to travel far out into the Alaskan Petroleum Reserve, which is basically untamed tundra wilderness for hundreds of miles. The oil companies would build these long ice roads in the winter that would lead to the exploration drilling pads. Our job was to go out after they finished the initial drilling and test rock formations for their oil production qualities. It was mid-January. The sun hadn't quite come up yet, and when I say the sun hadn't come up, I mean in almost a month and a half. Polar nights are intense. That particular well site we were traveling to was about 60 miles west of Alpine, Alaska, deep in the wilderness. Our job took about a week, but we finished and we're headed back to camp to finish our hike and go home. At the beginning and the end of the ice roads are guard shacks that have to check in and out for our safety. No cell reception, and radios only work up to a distance. If you don't check in or out on a set time, they come looking for you to ensure you're not a popsicle. It was about 4 in the morning. Not that it mattered in the land of endless night, and we were halfway across the ice road. Travel was slow, at the speed limit on the road is only 25 miles per hour. When something appeared on the road in our headlights, it was a man, in jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie jacket, walking down an ice road in wilderness tundra at 4 a.m., and it was negative 20 degrees outside. It's not unusual for the local Inuit people to be out this far hunting. Maybe a snowmobile broke down and he's trying to get back to the guard shack. Seems plausible. He didn't acknowledge us as our truck rolled up next to him. He just kept shuffling forward. He didn't seem cold. His clothes, while not appropriate for this extreme weather, appeared warm and dry. We also noticed he wasn't Inuit, but Caucasian. I rolled down my window and asked if he needed any help and if he was okay. He still didn't acknowledge us, just kept shuffling forward. His face was completely blank, devoid of any thought or emotions. The other guys in my truck suggested that maybe he was in an accident and in shock, and continued rolling my truck alongside him as he trudged down the road, still trying to get his attention. Even in this extreme cold, I could occasionally get whiffs of a peculiar smell coming from him. He smelled acidic, if that makes sense. There was just a lot about this guy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The guy behind me in the truck's crew cab had enough of all this. He rolled down the window and reached out to grab the guy. He later said that he was going to try and shake him out of his stupor. Before my buddy's hand could reach him, though, this walking popsicle spun around and lashed onto my buddy's outreached arm. He glared at my buddy and then at me with this look of pure rage, not removing his hand from his arm. If emotions at physical temperatures, this guy could have melted the entire tundra that night. My buddy groaned in pain as he tried to get his arm free from Mr. Popsicle. At that moment, this guy starts screaming in our faces. There was so much hate and rage and anger in that scream. It was absolutely terrifying. I slammed on the gas and spun out on the ice for a second before the wheels caught and launched us forward. Popsicle Dude still had a hold of my buddy's arm and was trying to pull him out of the truck. He was running alongside the truck while the other guys in the cab held onto my buddy to keep him inside. After several moments, it could have only been a few seconds at most, my buddy tore free from this guy and we hauled ass to the guard shack another 30 miles down the road. We checked in with the guards and reported what we have seen. The guard was looking at us like we were pulling a prank, but policy said that they had to check it out regardless. My buddy's arm was sore, and when he pulled back his sleeve, there was a noticeable bruise in the shape of a hand around his arm. We filed a report with the guard and we were told to head back to our camp. None of us really wanted to talk about what happened, and it was a quiet drive the rest of the way. We flew home the next day. The next time we saw the guard at the shack, we asked him if he ever saw Mr. Popsicle on his patrols. He told us that they searched up and down the ice road for a solid 12-hour shift and saw nothing, not even tracks in the snow leading off the road. He told us it was a good prank and that he'd get us back for making him waste a shift driving around. But it wasn't a prank. Who would make up a story like that? And who would willingly bruise their arm for a dumb prank? We never got a satisfying answer of what happened that evening. I still wonder about that dude, if he even was a dude. The Alaskan tundra is a weird place, and that was just one of my many weird stories from my time up there.
Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have on there is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on an orienting expedition, basically a long trek through woodland in rural villages following nothing but a map and compass. No GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience and you can camp and overcome hurdles together, etc. Anyway, I was out of shape at the time, so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienting was like. We didn't stay out overnight like I would have to during the real thing, but we hiked maybe 10 miles through woods in a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey, we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back to the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey, we were on a dirt trail heading uphill with bushes and trees on either side. We were marching onward in silence at this point when all of a sudden there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped out an old man in a black suit with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He looked late 70s, early 80s, very pale, liver spots dotting his face and a gray-white comb-over. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that to go into the woods? The instant thought seeing a guy his age out there in those clothes and those weather conditions was, this guy has lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice though, that puzzled me. The guy was bone dry, didn't have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked at seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking him if he was alright. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, then became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He started flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk, then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After maybe a minute, he disappeared ahead of us, but we could still hear him, so we continued to follow the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down and the slope was probably at a 40-degree angle, spanning 50 feet or more and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given there was no shrubs or roots to hold on to or anything. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering how the heck did he cross that so quickly and so cleanly. I mean, at that distance, it is hard to see the fine detail clearly, but I swear he still did not appear to be wet or muddy at all. Me and my uncle looked at each other, and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step toward the edge and was going to try to make my way down when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. Under his breath, he said to me, "Something's wrong here." He took a few steps back from the edge at this point, and the old man at the bottom started getting irate. He began pleading with us again to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help. His friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted to the old man that he would head back to our car and call emergency services for him, that professional help would be on its way soon, that they have all the tools to help him, etc. The old man suddenly got furious. He began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right now, or there would be hell to pay. His voice had changed drastically. He was practically growling his words, his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out of their sockets. His skin gone from pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter mile or so to the car, all the while my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services explaining to them that there was a possible mentally ill old man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get to our car and await the police so we could show them where we had encountered him. About an hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them, and packs of supplies like first aid, emergency blankets, etc. We led them to the exact spot and then pointed the 2 officers with dogs in the direction of the bushes he had led us through. The search lasted all weekend, There was no trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. This is one of my weirdest experiences to date.